Hello everybody and welcome. This is Word of Info and we're starting right away. Samar Ibrahim is at the controls and I'm Najla Naguib and with Dr. Amr Mabrouk, Professor of Plastic Surgery at Ain Shams University, and today we have our distinguished guest, His Excellency Ambassador Tan Hong Seng, Ambassador of the Republic of Singapore to Egypt. Hello everybody and welcome, and we're starting right away with Word of Info with His Excellency Ambassador Tan Hong Seng, Ambassador of the Republic of Singapore to Egypt.
Well, Singapore is one of the richest countries in the world and one of the fourth country in leading the economy, and it's one of the 5 busiest ports, and recently it has deserved its independence since 1965 with the 3rd highest per capita for a human being and a mixed population with multi-ethnicity, including 75% of Chinese origins, with Malays and Indians as a majority of the minority, and a founder of the Asian, and a great country or a great economic success, in spite of the fact that Singapore is a very small country, and despite of the fact that it has only 5 million people, yet these 5 million people are so much amalgamated together, made a great country and a great success story. And here we have the best man to talk about that, His Excellency Ambassador Tan Hong Seng, who is representing his country for the 3rd time in Egypt, but the first time as an ambassador, and he with the service in Thailand before, and a degree in political science from the university in Singapore, and another degree in master's degree from London. Of course, the very distinguished ambassador here in Egypt, and really we need to know a lot about the success story of Singapore. Sir, thank you very much for honoring us with this visit, and it's a great honor to have you with us in our show.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Amr, for having me on your program this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to see you and your lovely wife.
Thank you, sir. Well, we'll talk first about historical questions, and definitely Singapore is an island country which is made of 63 islands, yet in 1819 it was a small area with only 1,000 inhabitants. Do you think that 1819 is the real beginning of the miracle?
Well, 1819 is usually regarded as the starting point, so to speak, of modern Singapore, because it was in that year that Sir Stamford Raffles, a senior official of the East Indies Company, founded Singapore in a way. When he first reached Singapore in 1819, the island was a barren piece of land with only a few hundred sea gypsies staying there. But Sir Stamford Raffles had a vision. He had the vision of Singapore as a free port, and he saw the potential of Singapore, and he decided to buy it from the then Sultan of Johor. And that was how the history of modern Singapore started.
Some say that Singapore owes part of its success story to the Suez Canal. Do you agree with that?
Definitely, because as an entree port, Singapore, since the British time, depended on the free flow of trade, and the Suez Canal being a very important channel of communication, of trade between East and West, definitely facilitated the growth of Singapore as an entree port. So yes, in that sense,
they're closely related.
The fate of Singapore and Egypt are closely intertwined.
So we'll go a bit forward to a very bitter part of your history, which is World War II, which has seen the greatest devastation, and the Battle of Singapore in 1942, which even Churchill said that it is one of the great devastating defeats in the history of the empire, of the British Empire. It has left a bitter occupation that lasted for 3 long years, the Japanese didn't leave the country until the day of surrender. I mean, even after the day of surrender, they didn't leave except until September in 1945. Did this occupation help in shaping and developing the citizen of today and developing the sense of belonging?
Let me start by saying that the Japanese occupation of Singapore was a brutal and extremely difficult period of time for Singaporeans. But more importantly, I think what the Japanese occupation did was that it destroyed the widely held perception of British superiority, and it brought about the realization that Singapore can only rely on itself to defend its national interest. And this was a key factor in galvanizing public sentiments towards first supporting self-rule in 1959 and subsequently independence from the British under the Malaysian Federation in 1963. You had also asked about how this has shaped the sense of nationhood in Singapore. And here I must say that unlike Egypt, which is an ancient civilization, Singapore is a very young nation. As you had mentioned, we gained independence only in 1965, which means that Singapore is barely 48 years old.
Yes, very young, mashallah.
In the history of mankind, Singapore is like a little infant. The Japanese occupation was certainly a turning point.
So definitely, I mean, after the independence, as you have mentioned, the 1959 elections, which were crucial of the internal self-governing state and the acceptance of the British for that. Yet we have seen you in 1963 doing a sort of something which some people considered at the time as a real suicidal, that almost an independent country or country going into the route of independence is applying and forcing a neighboring strong country, please come and accept our federation with you, and by this I mean Malaysia. So in 1963 you agreed with Malaysia to be part of Malaysia, while you could have done the independence really on the spot as from the appearance. But you are here to tell us the real story, why you applied for the federation in 1963, and then in 1965, just 2 years later, applied or tried to make a vote to put yourself away from this federation, or even the Malaysians wanted to get rid of this union.
In 1963, Singapore joined the Federation of Malaysia, as you had correctly highlighted, for a very simple reason. Singapore is a small country without any natural resources, without a hinterland, and at that time our political leaders believed that in order to succeed, Singapore must become part of a larger entity, and the entity was the
nearby one,
Malaysian Federation. Unfortunately, the experience did not, or the experiment did not work out. And in 1965, 9 of August 1965, Singapore separated from Malaysia. And as our first Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, said in his memoirs, and these were his words in his book, he said, some countries are born independent, some achieve independence. Singapore had independence thrust upon it.
Yes. So actually Malaysia was the one who said to you, please go.
Well,
more or less.
you can read all about the details of the separation in Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs. He had written extensively about the separation in his memoirs, and I would commend it to you if you are interested.
Of course, definitely.
Knowing the details of the separation.
And the book has been translated in Arabic by one of the big translation homes, which is Lawaikan, and beautifully translated in Arabic, beside of course the English original book. So it's definitely a good idea to know the secret of success, right? Right from the mouth or from the written writing of the first Prime Minister, who is more or less considered to be the father figure of modern Singapore, right? And you had the chance, of course, to meet the gentleman and accompany him in several trips, right?
Yes, of course. It has always been a great learning experience to accompany Mr. Lee Kuan Yew on his many visits. And each time when we accompany him or sit in with him for his meetings, it's a good learning experience.
Real education. So if we may just shift away from our questions and we ask the classical question, I mean, the gentleman is considered historically to be the real father figure of modern Singapore, the independent modern Singaporean success story. So what was in his hands on the day of 9th of August in 1965 to make such a miracle? I mean, he has an independent state which hasn't changed much. The situation from 1963 to 1965, a small country with no natural resources, with no income except for a port, and definitely people who really want to succeed and make it. So is it only the will of the people that helped the Prime Minister, or there was a certain other ingredients in the recipe?
Let me answer this question by taking you one step back. The years following Singapore's independence in 1965 were very difficult ones. In a nutshell, the challenges were enormous because Singapore is small, Singapore is resourceless, we don't have any natural resources, and Singapore is vulnerable. And the first major challenge that the government faced was to restructure the economy and to create jobs. And at that time, Singapore's unemployment rate was between 10 to 12%. The political situation was unstable due to the very real threats posed by the communists. Additionally, Britain wanted to withdraw east of Suez, and the British bases in Singapore
were a source of income.
They were contributing 20% or 1/5 of our GDP at that time. So with no natural resources, without a hinterland, we had to come up with innovative economic strategies that will encourage foreign investment into the country and promote industrialization. And as Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had recounted in his memoirs, the government adopted a two-pronged strategy. The first was to leapfrog over the region. Hence, the government went against the conventional wisdom of that time, which was anti-multinational corporations. And we opened up Singapore to MNCs. We worked to attract MNCs to come to Singapore, to set up operations, to produce and to export their products to the world. This not only provided jobs for Singaporeans, but also brought technology transfer. The second part of the strategy was to create a first world oasis in the third world region. Essentially, the idea is for Singapore to establish a first world standards in public and personal security, health, education, telecommunications, transportation and services, so that we could become a base camp for entrepreneurs, for engineers, managers and other professionals who want to do business in Southeast Asia.
So definitely we would like to take this question after the intermission to say, how was this possible? I mean, this is everybody maybe at that period of time say the only hope is to do this, but as a lot of reports and statistics says, definitely Singapore is one of the most business friendliest countries in the world, and we have to discuss that maybe after the break.
Yes. So back again, word of info, and you can call us at 25789407. And today we are honored to have with us His Excellency Ambassador Tan Hong Sing, Ambassador of Singapore to Egypt, and Dr. Amr Mabrouk, Professor of Plastic Surgery at Ain Shams University. So back again, World of Info, and with our distinguished guest, His Excellency Ambassador Tan Hang Singh, Ambassador of Singapore to Egypt, and Dr. Amr Mabrouk, Professor of Plastic Surgery at Ain Shams University, and taking you back to Singapore.
Well, of course, we were talking about the success story, and definitely the population has its role, and the mosaic of the population is of different ethnic and religious group. How was the amalgamation of these groups possible to develop a powerful nation, which is everybody is trying to make this nation succeed, not trying to bring it backward by ethnic differences?
Well, that is a very complex question and really requires a very complex answer, but to make things easy, let me start by emphasizing the important role that leadership, especially political leadership, has played in transforming Singapore. And in that sense, Singapore has been very fortunate to have had enlightened political leadership. Basically, we have had political leaders who look long term, think long term, and most important of all, they place the interests of Singapore above their personal interest. And we were fortunate in that we have had a remarkable first generation of political leaders led by our Prime Minister that time, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and his team of very, very committed, dedicated and capable ministers. With their commitment and their vision, they were able to set Singapore on the right footing. Of course, we have since moved to the second and third generation of leaders, but we really owe a debt of gratitude to the first generation of leaders who, as I had said earlier, went against the grain of conventional wisdom to open up Singapore, to integrate Singapore into the global economic system. And they made very important decisions, took very important measures, and implemented very important policies that have laid the foundation for Singapore's economic development. And here I'll just like to highlight three of them. The first is the investment that Singapore has made in education and training in order to produce a highly skilled, productive and efficient workforce. More importantly, we continue to invest in retraining and upgrading to make sure that we continue to compete and remain relevant in a highly competitive global economy. As part of that, we also work very hard to maintain harmonious labor relations, because when MNCs come to Singapore to set up operations, they want to be able to operate in an environment where you don't have strikes, labor unrest every other day.
Yes.
And to achieve that, we have established what we call a tripartite structure, which comprise the labor movement, the private sector employers, and the government. This structure provides a platform for all the three parties to engage each other in dialogue rather than industrial action. It also allows the government and the labor movement to consult with the private sector on what they need.
So this leaves us to an important, I think, a great pillar. Beside this is the pillar of anti-corruption. I mean, Singapore, beside the Scandinavian countries, and New Zealand are considered to be the highest ranking countries as regards the lack of corruption on the governmental level. And I believe this is one of the secrets, great secrets of the success of Singapore as a country. How was that possible? I mean, it's a human nature, especially, let us open up the discussion. I mean, your first Prime Minister stayed in power for almost 25 years, from 1965 to 2000, and most of his aides-de-camp were some of his associates for quite a long time, or others of their aides. So how was it possible to combat a human being behavior of power corrupts?
You're absolutely right in saying that it's almost impossible to eradicate corruption. So what we try to do is to create an ecosystem in Singapore which minimizes the potential and the attraction of corruption. So what do? We ensure that the political leaders as well as the bureaucracy maintain the highest standards of integrity, and the political leaders and our public service leaders set the standard. But as you have rightly pointed out, no system is immune. And in recent months, there have been a number of high-profile scandals and corruption cases involving senior civil servants. So as we can see, it is very much an uphill task, but we try to do our best. We pay a competitive salary to our ministers and to our civil servants. We have very, very tough laws against corruption, and these laws are applied firmly and uniformly across the board. In other words, there is no exception. Even senior cabinet ministers who have run foul of the law are brought to task and they are prosecuted. So that helps to deter or discourage
violators,
corruption. And we also recognized that it's important to minimize corruption, because as we all know, corruption adds to the cost of doing business.
Of course. This is what I wanted to say. So maybe we reached the pillar that you have passed in smoothly, and I consider it to one of the great secrets of success, which is education. We now know that not only Singapore as a country was able to educate its people and teaching very high skills in education and postgraduate studies or postgraduate refining of the skills of its workers, yet 20% of your students are foreigners coming from other countries who are trying to gain higher education in Singapore, especially Malaysian people who are crossing the borders or crossing the bridge every day from Malaysia to Singapore to get this education. How was that education system was built in such a strong or compatible way to compete in the world of today?
As you know, the only natural resource that Singapore has is its people. So naturally we invest heavily in education. We recognize that a well-educated population with the relevant skills to offer to the global economy will help us attract investments and provide Singapore with a role in the global economy. So our education spending constitutes about 20% of our annual national budget.
Which is much higher than your defense budget, which is 4.5%, right?
They are the two, well, actually the three most important expenditures in our national budget are education, defense and health, which are all critical to the well-being of the people and of the country. So we spent a lot in terms of education, and a lot of that goes into improving training for teachers, because in order to upgrade your education, you need to have competent, well-trained teachers. We also spent considerably in terms of introducing IT into the classrooms. The government has structured the education in such a way that it provides Singaporeans with the skills that will be relevant for the global economy. So we emphasize the use of English as a medium of teaching.
Communication, yes.
At the same time, we require our students to learn their mother tongue as a second language. Such an approach enables Singaporeans to operate effectively in the business world. And with our bilingual policy, we have a large number of Singaporeans who are able to be fluent in both English and Mandarin, and that is a competitive advantage that we have, especially in Asia, where China has emerged as one of the most important economic centers.
Of course. So you spoke about health, and we have to talk about it since I'm a doctor. Health is well developed in Singapore, and definitely it's one of the best health taking care of system in the world. And now even you are acting as a haven for health tourists to come. Your plan is to get 1 million visitors per year asking for health care as regards not only cosmetic surgery but everything in the book. You are trying to open up for that as a sort of an investment and industrial activity. So how, first of all, was the idea of funding? You said that there were 20% of your economy or the GDP is going to education. How far is it going to healthcare system?
Healthcare financing is a very important issue for Singapore, especially with an aging population. As you know, we are not reproducing enough. So we have a declining population. We have one of the lowest birth rates in the world, and that is really the most serious long-term challenge facing Singapore. How to prevent Singaporeans from becoming extinct. Our healthcare financing system is basically anchored on two principles. One, individual responsibility, and two, affordable healthcare for all. We have developed a mixed financing system with multiple tiers of protection to make sure that no Singaporean is denied access to basic healthcare because of affordability issue. The first tier of protection is provided by heavy government subsidies of up to 80% of the total bill in public hospital wards, which is accessible to Singaporeans. And we use a means testing mechanism to determine the level of subsidy that each Singaporean patient is entitled to. Then we have a second tier of protection, which is provided by MediSave, which is a compulsory individual medical savings account scheme, which allows Singaporeans to pay for their share of medical treatment without imposing too much financial difficulty. So working Singaporeans like me, we contribute a part of our monthly wages into an account to save up for our future medical needs. And the third tier of protection is provided by MediShield, which is a low-cost medical insurance scheme. So this allows Singaporeans to effectively risk pool the financial risk of major illnesses. Then finally, there is Medifund, which is a medical endowment fund set up by the government to act as the ultimate safety net for needy Singaporeans who cannot afford to pay their own medical bills despite heavy subsidies. So this is how
so in the end you have a big safety net to take up or pick up any needy person who cannot afford.
Absolutely.
And this is the key to success. Now we have to talk about an important question or an important issue. As you have mentioned, you are exactly, or maybe even a smaller country than Switzerland, which has been neutral for quite a long time and having the problem to go into two nearby world wars, World War I and World War II, without getting involved, and they had a strong army to deter any invader or any trespassers. And so Singapore is trying to mimic more or less the Swiss example of defense, where every person in Singapore is given the chance, or by law, to be a member of the defense forces of Singapore. How was that possible? And at the same time, how can you really pay such, is it up till now important to pay such great funds for the defense? Or you think by time it could end up like Costa Rica, where nobody is paying for, they don't have an army? Although Switzerland, for example, voted for going and continuing to have their army up till whatever.
You're absolutely right to say that we have learned many important lessons from the Swiss experience. Like the Swiss, we have the concept of
not available.
We have the concept of a citizen army, where we have national service, which is military service for all male citizens aged 18 years old. I myself had served 2.5 years of
So you
national
have the rank
service.
of an officer, or
No, unfortunately I was only a non-commissioned officer. But you know, national service is an important element of our national defense strategy. But national service is also a very important tool or platform whereby we bring together Singaporeans of different races, of different backgrounds. We come together and we stay together, we train together.
so it's an amalgamating pot.
Yes, it helps us to develop that sense of Singaporeanness, so to speak.
But there is a problem which your Air Force, for example, has, which is that you don't have enough land or inland for training.
Airspace, we don't have enough airspace, which is true.
And so, strange enough, I know that the Swiss do a training in Sweden, the Israeli forces do training on the sea or in Turkey sometimes, but you are having bases of training in France, in the US,
Yes.
and in Australia, and I believe also in New Zealand, right?
That's right. That's
So some of the squadrons are stationed there all year round.
Absolutely.
That's interesting to have your service in a foreign country, right? More or less.
Well, that is how we overcome the limitations of our small size. But I think it also underscores the fact that our Singapore Armed Forces is primarily intended as a deterrence. It's defensive rather than offensive.
So some of the forces, the Air Force is stationed in Singapore, just
Yes.
on the alert, and the others are training abroad, more or less, right?
Yes.
That's really interesting, and really you're trying to tailor things according to the situation.
So we'll take a break here and we'll be back, and you can call us at 2578-9407. This is Word of Info, and with His Excellency Ambassador Tan Ong Sing, Ambassador of the Republic of Singapore to Egypt, and Dr. Amr Mabrouk, Professor of Plastic Surgery at Ain Shams University. And stay with us. So back again, and Word of Info, and we're heading to Singapore-Egyptian relations.
So definitely Singapore and Egypt had strong ties ever since the independence, right? Since 1965.
Yes.
You've been always having an embassy here in Egypt.
Indeed.
And another embassy, an Egyptian embassy in Singapore.
Yes.
Since 1965, right?
Well, we established our embassy in Cairo in 1966, 1 year after
Independence.
our independence. Probably less than a year after our independence, because that was the 9th of August, 65. And the embassy in Cairo was the first resident mission that Singapore established in the Arab world. And as you would read from Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, he and President Nasser were good friends. And our bilateral relations have always been anchored on very strong foundations, and bilateral relations have grown from strength to strength. Last year we celebrated the 45th year of the establishment of diplomatic ties. We had a joint stamp launch, and the feature of the stamp launch was the two rivers in our countries, the Nile of Egypt and the Singapore River in Singapore. Our relations span many areas. On the people-to-people front, we have about 200 Singaporean students who are studying at Al-Azhar University. Our Muslim students have been coming to study at Al-Azhar for many years. Our first Mufti was a graduate of Azhar. Our current Mufti is also a graduate of Azhar University.
MashaAllah.
So such relations are very deep, very historical. Economically, the bilateral engagement has also grown. We now have a number of Singapore companies operating in Egypt. You may be surprised to hear this, but about 60% of the cargo that come through Ain Sokna port are contributed by two Singapore shipping lines.
Really?
APL and PIL.
So you have a council over there in Sokna?
No, we don't. This
non-resident one,
this,
maybe.
this is cargo coming from Asia to Europe. We also have, of course, excellent bilateral political relationship. We have regular exchanges of high-level visits, and we are looking forward to, President Morsi making a visit to Singapore in the near future. We have also cooperated in terms of technical cooperation. About 300 Egyptian officials, they have undergone training courses in Singapore under the Singapore Cooperation Program in a wide range of areas from nursing to ICT, public administration, urban development, and civil aviation. And we are going to take this one step further. Singapore and Egypt are going to collaborate, and we will provide training to African countries, and this training will take place in Egypt. So that is another way by which we are going to expand our bilateral cooperation.
Thus, Singapore has an aid agency like, I know that for sure that Singapore is one of the greatest or the biggest 5 aid givers in all over the world as regards developing nations and their projects. So what are the rules of this aid agency that they're doing, and at the same time what types of projects that you are involved in?
The guiding principle behind our technical assistance program is this famous Chinese saying, which says that if you give a man a fish,
you feed him only
for a day, but if you teach him how to fish, he can feed himself for the rest of his life.
Exactly.
And that is really the main thrust of our program, which is called the Singapore Cooperation Program. Under this program, we have trained more than 16,000 officials from a wide range of countries, and essentially, as a small country, we know our own limitations. So we provide training courses in those areas where we feel we can make a contribution, where we feel that we can add value. So in some of those areas which I've already mentioned, like urban development, public administration, in ICT, in civil aviation, in port management, in tourism.
This is another important point, an issue just before we close the program. Singapore, in spite of the fact that it's a small country, yet it is able to attract 10.5 million tourists per year. How is that possible? This is an important question. Maybe we can take your expertise. Is it just because the fact that it is one of the safest havens in the world, or secure, or where the tourists feel very much safe and secure, or something else is in the recipe?
That is definitely one factor, the safety and security aspect. But I have always believed that to be successful in tourism, you must provide a total experience. And what I mean by that total experience is that from the moment you land at the airport to the time you get out of custom and immigration, to the taxi, to the hotel, your experience in the country itself, and then on the way back home through the airport again, you must have a positive experience. So for example, in Singapore, we have invested a lot of resources into developing Changi Airport. We want to make sure that visitors who come to Singapore, the moment they land, they get a positive experience. So from the time they land to the time they get through custom and immigration, and to the time they retrieve their baggage, it should be less, or it should not exceed 12 to 15 minutes.
Yes, and that's true. I've been to Singapore, and I still have this impression from from hour zero until I left Singapore.
So this is the idea is to make life easier for your guests and for your people, is more or less the motto of the country itself, right? This is one of the secrets.
I think that would be oversimplifying it. But in terms of tourism, I would say yes, you must make visitors to your country feel welcome. They should not have to be hassled at the immigration or the custom. They should not have to fight away touts when they want to take a taxi, or when they go to the Kanal Kalili.
Yes.
So because Egypt has so much to offer, and in my humble estimation, I think Egypt should be easily attracting 20-30 million visitors a year. You have the pyramids, you have history, you have the culture, you have the beaches, you have the desert. Egypt can really be a very, very attractive tourist destination.
So maybe before we finish, we have a minute to talk and say this is your third tenor in Egypt. And may I ask more or less a private question? Was it by choice or by only an obligation?
I hope my bosses are not listening in. I don't think they will be, because it's sleeping time in Singapore.
Yes.
But in our system, we do not get to choose where we want to go. But I have no regrets whatsoever coming to Egypt for 3 postings. Every one of them have been different. Every one of them have been fulfilling, challenging, and it has been 3 postings that we will always remember and cherish.
So by this we come to the end of Word of Info. We thank you very much, sir, for joining us. Excellency Ambassador Tan Hong Sing, Ambassador of Singapore to Egypt. Dr. Amr Mabrouk, Professor of Plastic Surgery at Ain Shams University. Samar Ibrahim was at the controls. I'm Najla Naguib. See you next Thursday, same time, same station, FM 95.4.